The oak table at the front of the County Grange Hall had held a lot of things over its 90 years, but never a stack of cutting boards worth more than the building itself. Mara Oatholt stood behind it, one hand resting flat on the topmost board, the grain of it running dark and gold beneath her palm like a river seen from the sky, and she said nothing at all. Across from her, Coleman Reeve was still smiling, but the smile had gone tight at the corners, the way a rope goes tight the instant before it takes the full weight, and everyone in that crowded hall could see him doing arithmetic behind his eyes and not liking the sum. He had come to buy her out. He had come with a folder and a fountain pen and a number he thought was generous. And she had just told him, in a voice level as poured water, that the number was wrong by a great deal and that she was not selling anyway. Now, before I take you back to how a woman with $40 and a dead husband's truck ended up holding all the cards in that room. And by the way, wherever in the world you're watching from right now, let me know in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories reach, okay? Where were we? You should understand that only 3 winters before this, the whole of Halvers County had agreed that Mara Oatholt had finally lost whatever sense grief had left her. They had watched her back that rusted truck up to the burn pile behind Reeves' lumber mill and load it, board by splintered board, with what the mill threw out. And they had laughed, the particular quiet laugh that small places keep for the people they have decided to pity. I.e.s. a wind. Then, to a raw morning, in the 3rd week of October, the year the sky over Halvers County stayed the color of wet ash for 11 days running. Mara was 41 that autumn and had been a widow for 14 months. Her husband, Dell, had gone under the ice of the North Pond the January before last, chasing a heifer that had wandered where no heifer should, and the county had turned out for the funeral, and then, as counties do, turned back to its own business. Mara had kept the small farm at the end of Sorrel Road because she did not know how to do anything else, and because leaving felt like a second drowning. 40 acres, most of it too stony to plough, a barn with a suede spine, and a banknote that came due every spring, like a debt to the season itself. She had gone to the mill that morning to ask about work. Coleman Reeve ran the only sawmill for 30 miles, a long, low building that smelled of resin and hot steel, and he ran it the way a man runs a thing he believes he cannot lose. He hired men, not widows. He told her so with a kindness that was worse than cruelty, his hand on her shoulder, his voice pitched for the benefit of the 2 men grinning behind him. There was no work for her. But if she wanted, he said, she could haul off some of the burn pile, the offcuts, the cracked boards, the walnut that came in with wormholes and knots and long black streaks of what he called rot. He was going to burn it Saturday. She'd be doing him a favor, saving him the match. He meant it as charity, dressed up as a jest, a way to send her off feeling she'd been given something. What he did not know, because he had stopped looking at wood as anything but board feet a long time ago, was that Mara Oatholt had grown up in her grandfather's chair shop, and that her hands remembered the difference between rot and figure the way a musician's hands remember a tune the mind has forgotten. She walked the burn pile slowly. The other men had gone back inside, and there, in the grey light, she saw what Reeve could not. Those black streaks he called rot were not rot at all. They were spalting, the fine dark veining that certain fungi draw through walnut and maple before the wood goes soft, a marbling that no mill can manufacture and no rich man can buy on purpose, worth more to the right eye than any clean plank. The wormholes ran through crotchwood, the place where a limb forks from a trunk, where the grain swirls and folds into figure that furniture men across the country pay dearly for. And the cracks were only cracks, and cracks could be filled, she counted with her eyes. There were perhaps 400 board feet in that pile that Coleman Reeve was going to set fire to on Saturday to save himself the trouble of moving it. She did the arithmetic where she stood, in the cold, her breath hanging in front of her. If she could take it for nothing, and if her hands still knew what they had once known, then the cost of this thing was only her labor and her time. And both of those she now had in a terrible abundance. She went back inside and found Reeve and asked him, in a voice she kept small on purpose, what he wanted for the whole pile. He laughed. He said $1 if it made her feel better about it, since a body ought to pay something for anything, so it didn't feel like begging. She took a single crumpled bill from her coat and laid it on the cold sore table and said she'd want a receipt. The two men behind him thought that was the funniest thing they had heard all week. Reeves scrawled something on the back of an invoice. Sold, Walnut burn pile, $1, paid, and signed it, still grinning, and she folded it into her breast pocket like a deed. It took her 4 days to haul it all. The truck could carry only so much before the leaf springs groaned, and the road up to Sorrel was rutted from the rains, and more than once she had to stop and stack the load tighter with her bare red hands. People saw her. Of course, they saw her. In a county that size, a widow hauling a mill's garbage up a dead-end road is the whole of the week's news. They said she'd gone soft in the head with sorrow. They said Dell would have been ashamed. They said, in the low charitable murmur that passes for compassion in a place too small to keep secrets, that somebody ought to look in on her before winter, poor thing. Alone out there talking to firewood, she did not answer any of it. She had already learned the first hard thing, which was that being right about something is a lonely place to stand, and that when you cannot prove a thing yet, silence unsettles people far more than argument ever could. She stacked the walnut in the barn where the suede roof still kept the weather off, and she sticketed, laid thin strips between each board so the air could move through and the wood could dry slow and even, the way her grandfather had taught her, a 1/4 inch of drying for every year the tree had grown, patience measured against patience. And then she stood in the doorway of that barn in the failing October light and looked at 400 board feet of what everyone she knew believed was worthless. And for the first time in 14 months, she felt something that was not grief. He did not have a name for it, yet it sat in her chest like a coal banked under ash, small and hot and hidden, and she meant to keep it hidden until she was ready. That was where the old man found her. Josef Wenninger farmed the parcel that bordered hers to the east, 80 years old and 80 years stubborn, a man who had come across an ocean as a boy with a chest of chisels and not much else, and who had built cabinets in the old country before the wars took the country apart. He had kept mostly to himself since his wife passed, and Mara had exchanged perhaps a dozen sentences with him in all the years she'd lived on Sorrel Road. But he came up the lane that evening, leaning on a cane cut from his own ash, and he looked past her into the barn at the stacked wood, and his old eyes went sharp the way a hawk's do. He walked the stacks slow. He ran a thumbnail along a black vein of spalting. He held a piece of the crotch walnut up to the last of the light and turned it, and something moved across his face that she recognized because it was moving across her own. He set the board down gently, the way you set down something living. They laughed at you, he said. It was not a question. His accent bent the words, made them longer, gave them weight. They did, she said. He nodded slowly. A tree does not grow its best wood in easy ground, he said. The wind, the drought, the wound where the branch tore away. That is where the grain learns to be beautiful. Smooth wood is cheap wood. What breaks a tree is also what makes it worth the saving. He tapped the stack once with his cane. You have not bought garbage, girl. You have bought the years this wood spent surviving. She would carry that sentence with her all through the winter, and the 2 winters after it, turning it over in the dark, the way you turn a stone in your pocket. What breaks a thing is also what makes it worth the saving. It became the arithmetic she counted by when the other arithmetic, the banknote, the propane bill, the empty side of the bed, threatened to overwhelm her. Joseph came back the next morning and the morning after that. He was too old to lift, but he was not too old to teach, and he had a lifetime of knowing locked up in those crooked hands with nowhere left to pour it. He showed her how to read the moisture in the wood by weight and by the sound a board made when you tapped it, dead and dull when it was green, bright and clear when it was ready. He showed her how to true a warped plank and how to mill her own strips on Dell's old table saw, which had sat under a tarp in the machine shed since the funeral. He showed her the difference between an edge-grain board and an end-grain board. How you could take the small offcuts, the pieces too short to be worth anything as lumber, and stand them on end and glue them into a checkerboard so dense and so beautiful that a knife would sink into it without dulling. Kitchen counter, the waste, he told her. The waste is where the money hides, because no one else will do the work. The other thing that found her that winter was a child. Reeve's sister's boy, a thin, quiet 9-year-old named Theodore, whom everyone called Teddy, whose mother worked nights at the cannery in the next county, and who was, in the practical arithmetic of that household, more or less left to raise himself. He'd taken to wandering, and his wandering brought him up Sorrel Road to the one place where interesting sounds came out of a barn all day. He stood in the doorway the first time and said nothing, and Mara, who was not much for talking either, said nothing back, and after a while he came in and started sorting offcuts into piles by colour without being asked. Light wood here, dark wood there. The pieces with the black lightning in them he set apart in a pile of their own because he said they looked like weather, and she looked at that pile of spalted walnut. A 9-year-old had separated out on instinct and understood that the boy had the eye too. He named the boards. He gave them all names. This one was Thunderhead. This one was Riverbend. This one, with the tight, swirling crotch figure, he called the Owl because he swore he could see a face in it. And Mara, who had spent 14 months in a silence so complete it had begun to ring, found herself talking again to an old immigrant with a cane and a neglected boy with sawdust in his hair, and, slowly, the coal under the ash grew warmer. Through November and into the black heart of December, she worked. She rose before light and went to the barn and did not stop until she could no longer see. She milled and glued and clamped and planed, and she made mistakes. The first 3 boards cupped and split because she'd rushed the glue up, and she'd stood over the ruined pieces near tears until Joseph said, without looking up, that a man who has not thrown away his first work. So she began again, and by the time the snow lay 2 feet deep across the county and the cold came down out of the north hard enough to crack the trunks of trees in the woodlot with a sound like rifle fire, she had made 11 cutting boards, end grain, oiled to a deep glow, each one holding a slice of that spalted walnut like a photograph of a storm. She did not show a soul. She wrapped them in an old quilt and stood them against the wall of the front room. And when Joseph asked her why she did not take them to town, she said the county was not ready to be told it had been wrong to laugh, and that a thing built in secret keeps its value better than a thing shown too soon. Success, she had decided, was like the coal under the ash. You did not fan it in front of people who would only spit on it. You banked it low, and you fed it, and you waited. What she did instead was quieter and smarter. She drove 80 miles to the city, to a district of galleries and kitchen shops and restaurants, where chefs paid for their knives what a Halvers County man paid for a rifle, and she carried in 3 of her boards, wrapped in the quilt, and she set them on the counter of a shop that sold nothing but the finest kitchen goods, and she said nothing. While the owner looked, the woman picked up the owl. She turned it over. She ran her fingers across the spalting and asked, in the careful voice of someone trying not to seem too eager, where a piece like this had come from. And Mara Oudholt, standing in her dead husband's coat, with 40 miles of winter road behind her, learned in that moment the true weight of the coal she had been banking, because the woman offered her, for that single board, more than Coleman Reeve had paid 3 of his men to work a day. She priced them fairly, and she priced them high, because Joseph had taught her that a thing sold too cheap is a thing not believed in, and the shop took all 3 and asked for 6 more by spring. She drove home in the dark, with the empty quilt on the seat beside her, and money in her breast pocket, where the receipt still lived, and she did not tell anyone in the county a word about it. Winter deepened, and here the story turns, the way these stories always turn, on a thing no one chose and no one could stop. It began with the ash trees. The emerald borer had been creeping westward across the state for years, a small green beetle that ate the living wood of ash trees from the inside until the trees died standing. And that spring it reached Halvers County all at once, as if the 11-day grey sky of that October had been an omen. By May, the county's ash woodlots were dying by the hundred, and Coleman Reeves' mill, which had built its whole trade on clean ash and clean maple, on the perfect straight-grained lumber that furniture factories wanted by the truckload, found itself sitting on a mountain of wood that was cracking and staining and going, in the language of the trade, punky, soft and blemished and unsellable to the customers who had always wanted their wood flawless. The perfect wood was dying. The factories that bought Reeves lumber wanted no part of stained, checked Boratract board, and they cancelled their orders one after another through that spring, and the mill that had never lost began, very quietly, to lose. Reeve laid off 2 men in June. He mortgaged the yard in August. And all across the county, the men who had laughed at the widow hauling garbage up Sorrel Road watched their own clean, sound, valuable ash trees die where they stood, and did not yet see the joke turning to point the other way. Because here's the thing about the wood that Mara Oatholt had, by then, filled her whole barn with wood she'd gone on gathering from Reeves' burn pile for another $1 a lot, all through that year while he was glad to be rid of it. The very thing that was killing the county's timber was the thing that made her boards. The stain the factories rejected was the spalting the galleries craved. The character that ruined a plank for a table leg was the character that made it priceless in the hand. What broke the tree was what made it worth the saving. The disaster that was hollowing out Coleman Reeves' fortune was pouring the foundation of hers. She did not gloat. That was not in her. She kept working, kept driving to the city, kept banking the coal. By the second autumn, she had 3 galleries and 11 restaurants, and a woman in the city who had asked to represent her work to a national catalogue. By the third spring, the number in her account had crossed into a place she had never let herself imagine. 6 figures where once there had been $40 and a banknote she could not meet, and she had paid off the farm and put a new spine in the barn roof, and bought Teddy the good bicycle his mother could never afford, and none of it, not 1 dime of it, had come from anything but the garbage a proud man had tried to burn. The county noticed the way a county does. Trucks came up Sorrel Road now that were not laughing. A city magazine sent a writer. The talk turned first, as Joseph had warned her it would. Ugly, for it is easier to believe a woman has done something crooked than to admit you were a fool to mock her, and there was muttering that no honest work made that kind of money, that she must be doing something out there, that grief could turn a person strange. She let it pass. She had learned that, too. You cannot argue a person out of a shame they are not ready to feel. You can only keep working until the work itself becomes the argument. And then, in the third autumn, the reckoning came into the open, and it came wearing Coleman Reeves' face. He came up Sorrel Road on a grey morning not so different from the one 3 years before, and he stood in the barn doorway where a neglected boy had once stood, and he looked at what she had built, the racks of drying walnut, the glue-ups in their clamps, the finished boards glowing on the wall, the whole living factory of it. And the county had told him she was making money, and he had come to get himself some of it. His mill was failing, his yard was mortgaged, and here was the widow he'd handed a burn pile as a joke, sitting on a fortune made of his own leavings, and he could not abide it. He was smooth about it. He always had been. He said he'd always known she had a good eye. Said it warmly, as if he had not laughed her out of his mill 3 years before. He said the two of them ought to partner up, his mill, her designs, his knowledge of the trade. He'd handle the business end naturally, being that he had the experience, and she could keep on with her little boards. He had a folder, and he had an offer to buy a controlling share of what she'd made, a number he clearly believed was more money than a widow from Sorrel Road had any right to refuse. She looked at the number, then she looked at him, and she asked him mildly how he had come to know how many boards she'd sold to the catalogue that spring, because that figure was in no folder and on no invoice. That figure lived only in her private ledger and in the account of the woman in the city who represented her. The barn went very quiet, because Coleman Reeve, in his hurry to seem like a man who knew her business, had said the number out loud, and there was only one way he could have come by it. He had gone to her buyers behind her back. He had tried to muscle in on her sales, tried to sell them his own dying stained ash, as though it were the same thing, tried to trade on her name and her success, while telling her buyers he was her partner already. They had turned him away. That was why the catalogue woman had called Mara, puzzled, a month before, asking who this Reeve fellow was, who kept telephoning, and in his overreach he had learned a private figure he now could not explain how he knew. He had counted her coin in the dark, and the dark had given him away. That is the scene the Grange Hall was waiting for, the scene we began in. 3 days later, when the Counties Growers Cooperative held its autumn meeting in the old hall, and Coleman Reeve, still believing he could carry it off in public where his charm ran deepest, stood and made his offer again in front of the whole assembled county. The folder in his hand, the generous number on his lips, the smile stretched tight as rope. He framed it as rescue, the mill and the widow, joining forces to save the county's timber trade. He was very good. Half the room was nodding before he finished, and Mara Oatholt stood behind the oak table with her hand flat on the topmost board, and let the silence stretch until it hummed. Then she spoke, and her voice was level as poured water, and it carried to every corner of that hall. She said she would not be selling any share of anything, not to him and not to anyone. She said the wood he tried to burn had turned out to be worth more than the mill that made it, because he had spent his life confusing the price of a thing with the worth of it, and those had never once been the same. She said he'd counted her sales in the dark because he'd gone to her buyers, pretending to be something he was not, and she named the date and the figure and watched the colour leave his face while the county did the arithmetic he'd hoped they'd never do. And then, because she was who she was, she did the thing that turned a vindication into something larger. She said she'd been thinking about the ash, about the hundreds of acres of stained, bore-attract, unsellable timber dying across the county, the wood the factories had rejected, the wood that was breaking every grower in that room. She said that stain was spalting, same as her walnut, and that character was character wherever it came from, and that a market existed. She had built it for exactly the wood everyone else was burning. She said she would buy that ash, not for the pennies a desperate man takes, but for a fair price, a true price, enough to keep a family on its land through a bad year. She would take the county's ruined trees and turn them into the thing the whole wide world outside Halvers County had turned out to want, and she would pay the growers honestly to do it. And she would hire the men Reeve had laid off to run the milling because they had hands that knew wood. She did not ruin Coleman Reeve, though she held the power to. She could have named the price he'd paid her, $1, 1 lot, a burn pile, and let the hall laugh him out the door the way he'd once laughed at her. Instead, she offered even him a fair rate for his mortgaged yard's remaining stock, the same rate as any grower, no better and no worse, which was its own kind of verdict, because it treated him as merely equal to the men he'd looked down on all his life. And there is no punishment for a proud man crueler or more just than being made ordinary. She said one last thing before she sat down. She said Joseph Wenninger had told her once that what breaks a tree is what makes it worth the saving, and that she had come to believe the same was true of places and of people, and maybe even of a county that had spent 3 years being wrong. The wound, she said, is where the light gets in. Then she signed the first purchase contract right there on the oak table, and it was to old Joseph himself, for a woodlot of dying ash, and the sum she wrote made the old man set his cane against the table and press his knuckles to his mouth. The coal under the ash, banked and hidden and fed through 3 long winters, had finally been let up into the open, and it did not burn anyone. It warmed the whole cold room. Coleman Reeve did not partner with her, but the men from his mill did. By the following spring, the workshop at the end of Sorrel Road had grown into a low new building beside the mended barn, and 8 men and 2 women worked in it, and the trucks that came up the road came empty of laughter and full of the county's broken timber, and they left, carrying boards bound for cities whose names most of Halvers County had only ever seen on maps. Teddy, 14 now, and grown afoot, ran the sorting floor after school and still named every board that showed a face in the grain. And the catalogue woman in the city could not get enough of any of it, because the story sold as surely as the wood, the widow, the burn pile, the fortune pulled from what a proud man tried to set alight. Joseph Wenninger lived to see 2 more awesomes. On the last good afternoon of the first of them, Mara found him sitting in the workshop doorway in the low gold light, watching the sawdust drift, and he patted the bench beside him, and she sat, and for a long while neither of them said anything, which was how they had always talked best. Then he tapped the arm of the bench once, the way he'd once tapped the stack of scorned walnut with his cane, and he said that when he was a boy across the ocean, his own grandfather had told him that no tree grows straight in a hard wind, and that he had spent 80 years finding out it was true. He said she had done the thing he had waited his whole long life to see someone do, which was to look at what the world had thrown away and see, instead of ruin, the shape of what it had survived. The arithmetic of greed had told Coleman Reeve to burn what he could not sell. The arithmetic of survival had told a grieving woman to gather it up. And in the end, it was the second arithmetic that saved the county, because greed can only ever count what a thing is worth today, while survival learns to count what a thing might become. Mara Oudholt stood in the workshop doorway on that last gold afternoon. No longer alone, no longer pitied, the coal long since grown into a steady, honest fire. And she thought that Dell would not have been ashamed after all. She thought he might even have understood that the wound is where the light gets in, that what breaks a thing is what makes it worth the saving, and that a widow with $40 and a dead man's truck, standing at the end of a dead-end road in a county that had decided she was mad, had turned out to be not the end of a story at all, but the beginning of one, the beginning of many, one person alone, which the world had always spoken as a sentence, spoken now, for the first time, as a start.